Well, let's proceed. Welcome, everybody. I'm Lyle Goldstein. I am in the helping out in the China Initiative, and really thrilled to welcome everybody here. I know this is an extremely busy time of year, students and faculty, so thanks for taking the time out. I myself am just back from East Asia, where I was for 3 weeks, so forgive me if I'm just a little bit jet lagged. But I was just on in, have a seat. Also say hello to the, we are broadcasting this on the YouTube channel live, so that's great that we can have an audience that goes beyond the room. But as I was in Taipei at the National Palace Museum, first visit there, really is probably the most extraordinary collection of Chinese antiquities. But you come in and one of the first amazing pieces that you see is this incredible scroll that stretches across the room, and of course it's about 1,500 years old, going back to the Tang Dynasty, and this was a collaborative project among an Indian and Chinese monk to, translate some of these critical sutras from the Buddhist religion. So you can see that this is a remarkable the remarkable influence and long-lasting importance of Indian and Chinese interaction. So now Brown, of course, we have one of the most outstanding South Asia centers in the country. So no surprise that we're putting a focus on this issue. And I can remember when I worked at Naval War College for a long time, I would come up here occasionally to hear important lectures, including by Ambassador Rao, who gave several lectures on that critical topic about a decade ago. But so this will be the first of 3 lectures on this subject. The next one is a virtual one on Thursday morning with a specialist from Fudan University in Shanghai, and then we'll follow up a week or so after that with the final lecture in the series with a Brookings scholar. But today I'm very thrilled to welcome our own Arvind Subramanian, who is a senior fellow here at Watson. He previously was professor at Ashoka University. He was visiting lecturer at Harvard and also senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He was chief economic advisor to the government of India from 2014 to 2018, and named by Foreign Policy as one of the top 100 global thinkers, which doesn't surprise me at all. I first became acquainted with his work when I read his incredible book, Eclipse, and really changed a lot of my thinking about China and about the Chinese economy. And I think a lot of what he discussed there in that fine book has been borne out since it was written. That's my impression. Anyway, so thrilled to have you, Arvind, and we'll love to have lots of very dynamic Q&A after Professor Subramanian speaks for 25 or 30 minutes. Great.
Great. Thanks very much, Lyle, for the kind introduction. I just want to begin by saying that I know nothing about security and foreign policy and stuff like that. And so there are really important aspects of the India-China relationship, maybe even the more important ones, that I will only peripherally touch upon because I shouldn't presume any expertise on that. I focus instead more on the broader picture, focusing more on the economic and trade dimensions of the relationship and how they're playing out in fairly, I think, important ways. I mean, even 5 years ago, if you said, what do you think of the India-China economic and trade relationship? I mean, on my list of things to think about, that would have been high up there. But I do think things have changed in a way that make this a kind of really important, in a way that things have evolved in such a manner as to make this a really interesting and rich subject for discussion. So let me just, I'm just going to kind of go through the evolution of what's happened in the last, say 5 to 10 years, and then we can have Q&A. So I think you have to begin this relationship by, the famous Bismarck quote. Bismarck said about the US that it had this very favorable geography, surrounded on 2 sides with weak neighbors and 2 sides with fish. So India is kind of exactly the opposite, right? It has fish on 3 sides, but it has 2 difficult neighbors on 2 sides. So I think that contiguity sets, in a sense, the one strategic dimension of the relationship. And if you think about it, obviously the border is a big part. There was a war in 1962. We've had a renewal of resumption of skirmishes / whatever light exchanges since 2020. There's been the whole Tibet and Dalai Lama question hanging over. And in some ways, a kind of an issue that people don't talk about enough, but I do think it's looming in the future, is the fact that China is kind of the upstream state to India. And so as global warming happens, as water becomes more scarce, as China continues building dams on the other side, I think this water dimension, which I will not touch upon after I say this, but it is something that I think people have been worrying about and thinking about on the Indian side for some time. So those kind of are the kind of broader issues that I think people need to think about. Then, of course, in 2020, we've had these resumption of minor skirmishes, warfare. And in a sense, it's really changed the Indian situation, because India, whereas it was previously in a kind of one and a half front strategic, thought strategically as a one and a half front situation, now it's in a 2-front situation as far as the military and defense expenditures go. And therefore, the strains it's going to place on India's defense expenditures, both quality and quantity, are going to, that's changed significantly after 2020, and how India is going to manage that, especially with the pressures on its budget, with the fact that defense, India spends much more on personnel than on equipment. It finds it difficult to procure equipment. So a series of kind of layered problems that India has, that 2020 has really brought to the fore. On the trade and economic dimension, 5 years ago, India was a bit like the United States in its trade relationship with the US, with one difference. The commonality was that India was as obsessed with the trade deficit with China as the US has been, always, because the Indian trade deficit with China is pretty big, $50 billion, rising, always been high. But the difference with the US, of course, is that the pattern of the relationship was also kind of unfavorable. It was kind of the periphery core relationship where India not only does it have a huge trade deficit, but it exports commodities and imports, finished goods. So it's like, we're kind of you're doing the value-added, sophisticated stuff, and we're supplying you. And that was always in the background, a bit of a thorn in the flesh of the relationship, but nothing seriously that happened. After, of course, 2020, India has imposed a series of restrictions on trade. It's banned TikTok, for example, sensitive equipment. I think China is not allowed to bid for a whole bunch of equipment. So I think India has taken kind of retaliatory trade action, again, not dissimilar to what the United States did, began under Trump and has continued and, of course, expanded under the Biden administration. But for very different, the motivations being very different. So it's partly this context that explains why India, even though it recognizes, and I'm going to come to this very, kind of interesting and unique and opportunity-filled geopolitical moment for India, that despite the opportunity, India has actually stayed out of the most dynamic free trade agreement in Asia, which is the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is basically everyone in Asia, including China, Australia, Japan, Korea, etc., etc. And India was offered had the chance twice to join this, but I think has stayed out. And I think the explanation is, essentially because it's partly strategic because China is part of that, but it's also trade and economic related because, in a sense, India joining RCEP would be like India having a free trade agreement with China. And given this, the bilateral trade relationship, given the sense that, China, does industrial policy, all these things, that it would be a kind of unfair trade relationship to India's disadvantage, and therefore India stayed out of RCEP with some significant costs that we can talk about. So then we had kind of 2 or 3 big developments on the globalization front. First, we had the global financial crisis, and of course, China becoming uncompetitive in many of the low-skilled sectors. So China was kind of vacating space for countries like India and Vietnam, Bangladesh to take advantage of. India was not able to take advantage of that first wave of opportunity that came India's way. Then, of course, COVID happened, and COVID was a globalization shock that differentially favored India and kind of disfavored China in the following sense that, in any case after the global financial crisis, global trade was not quite decoupling, but the hyper-globalization had stalled. And with COVID, had a great impact on manufacturing trade because, of course, but it didn't really adversely affect services trade. So the consequence of the global financial crisis and the COVID shock was that China, which was relatively more, a juggernaut in the manufacturing space, and India, which has been doing very well in the services space, that differentially favored India. And India's, I think, capitalizing on that. India's IT services are, taking advantage of the global boom in IT services. Then, of course, we had this third big globalization shock related to geopolitics. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, U.S.-China rivalry, and therefore the pressure on foreign capital, especially U.S. capital and foreign capital more broadly, to diversify away from China. Of course, aided by U.S. policy of friendshoring, industrial policy, etc. And this, I think, is already beginning to work in India's favor, because whereas the first wave, India never really took advantage because Vietnam and Bangladesh and India's own business environment wasn't considered good enough. But now, thanks to some policies, the Modi government has built up infrastructure, it's built up the digital space, it's taking action to, and of course, it's providing a lot of subsidies. So a combination of all these, plus this geopolitical move which has pushed capital away from China, is beginning to redound to India's benefit. And the big coup, of course, is Apple, which has located in India, and it has said that it will phase in, some target like, 15-20% of global production over 5-10 years will take place from India. So this is like an iconic company at a kind of critical geopolitical juncture, has placed its bet in favor of India. The irony and the dilemma for India, of course, is that Apple coming in. Apple cannot just produce in India because it needs a lot of Chinese suppliers for its production. So I think part of the the delicate negotiation has been that India will have to allow some of these Chinese components producers either to come to India or to import from China. So that kind of raises its own tricky, India having actually taken action against China after 2020 and thereafter is having to reconsider some of that in order to attract, Apple. So, but in a sense, this is, because, the meta background to this, of course, is that India has never been able to really do manufacturing on the scale of China has. India missed the manufacturing boat, 30 years ago. It's been trying to catch up, not very successfully. But there is a sense that a combination of, very aggressive subsidization, plus, a building up of infrastructure, which has improved considerably. The digital infrastructure, India has also done a terrific job. Plus this push away, geopolitical push, has created a configuration that creates a real opportunity for India to become a base for, to kind of try and rehabilitate some of the manufacturing that India was never able to do. So I think in that sense, this is a kind of big moment for India for its whole trade and development strategy. And the geopolitical and China thing has been, is a big factor, which could have material impact on India's, trajectory for attracting FDI, doing manufacturing going forward. A couple other interesting things, of course, is that, and this others will speak to better than I will, but the whole. The Russia-China alliance and India's dependence on Russia for its defense equipment, about 70%, is going to, create an impetus in India to kind of diversify its own military and defense, procurement, as it were, apart from indigenizing and building domestic capability, whatever foreign sourcing that it does, the reliance on Russia, I think, India will start to seriously think about diversifying away in favor of, Western suppliers, Israel, France, US. So Indo-West trade, even if, India is not going to be part of any security alliance, there will be this natural, I think, tendency to increase economic and trading relationship on the defense side with the West, and of course it could be any of these. A minor development, India is, president of the G20, and India has been reasonably active on some of these multilateral issues, which, in the past India was not very active in. So, for example, in the whole, how should the world resolve developing country debt? There was a common framework, and India has very much come down on the side of favoring these multilateral approaches, which China was kind of reluctant to embrace. I think during the spring meeting some progress has been made, but the kind of multilateral framework was basically that all bilateral creditors needed to take a haircut, but not the multilateral creditors, because that's how the multilateral system works. China was reluctant to do that, but I think recently, it's over the last week, there has been some progress with China being more willing to, consider, contributing to these things and not wanting the multilaterals also to take a haircut as a precondition for these arrangements. And India, because India it also has a direct role in Sri Lanka, because India is also connected to Sri Lanka. But I think it was taking a more sort of principled position on the G20 front, so it's an opportunity. So I think even as I was trying to prepare to to give this talk, I just realized that all these things that have come up I mean, they were almost absent 4 or 5 years ago. And so in that sense, this has become a very important and a critical relationship, which, let's see how it pans out going forward. But certainly there have been aspects to this which have really worked in India's favor, especially this broader geopolitical push of capital towards India, which combined with India's own change development strategy is creating an opportunity here. So the way I want to summarize this is by you were kind enough to mention my book Eclipse. So I wrote this book in 2011, I think. So I think in 2012 I used to go a lot to China to give talks on my book. And what always struck me then was that if you went to officialdom, private sector, big shots, they would always ask me questions about the United States. How are they doing, whatever, because that was their perspective. But when I went to universities and spoke to the younger generation, their interest was in me as an Indian and what was happening in India, etc., etc. So at one stage, I used to think of India looming in the Chinese consciousness in this meta sense that if India could pull off a reasonable development success, it would really call into question the Chinese model. The Chinese model being that you get economic success, but you have to kind of pay a price, and that freedoms, etc., etc. For poor countries, they don't necessarily go together. And India would be, in some ways, the only comparator because of the same size, the same diversity. And if India could pull this off, that would be like a real, at an existential level, a challenge for the Chinese consciousness, as it were. But over the last 4 or 5 years, they're becoming more like each other in some ways. India's state capacity to do things like infrastructure is becoming like China's. But then equally, the drift in Indian politics and Indian institutions and, the use of state capacity, not just for good, but also for surveillance, all these things. So I was asking myself, if I went back to China, would the students, ask the same question of me, with the same motivation and the same perspective? And I'm not so sure. So let me end there.
Okay, wonderful. There's a lot. You've given us a lot to think about. I myself have about 50 questions for you. I'll keep it to one and let you, you all think on your questions. But one of the interesting phenomena, you spoke about all these shocks, and I think it really has been a very, certainly from an economic point of view, geopolitical, it's been a very interesting several years. But how about this phenomena of de-dollarization? In Eclipse, you spoke a lot about that, and I think, if I recall, you ended the book talking about this poison chalice of taking over like a global currency. But how do you see the process of de-dollarization, and think that this has legs, if you will, or is it mostly kind of clamoring for attention?
So I somewhat rashly, and I think while I kind of predicted, and it was not a big prediction, I mean, many people did it, China's rise and China's dominance was kind of foreseeable, and it's come to pass in many ways. I did also think that the Chinese currency would progressively start challenging the dollar's preeminence. I think it's fair to say that it didn't happen at all to the extent that I anticipated. And that, the dollar has proven resilient, small shifts in favor of other currencies, including the renminbi, but nothing really big, no big shifts. But I think that what none of us foresaw was the weaponization of the dollar and finance that the US did. The sanctions that it imposed on Russia, especially the freezing of the dollar assets of the Russian central bank, I think has been a really watershed moment in how the world sees the role of the dollar. Now, all countries now, and famously Lula 3 days ago said, I wake up every day and say, why do we do everything in dollars, etc., etc. He expressed his opinion. So I think there's been a seismic shift, a seismic event. The problem is, the problem with what went wrong, or where I think I misdiagnosed this was when I said that the renminbi would challenge the dollar. We all kind of assumed that broadly the Deng progression would continue, which meant, among other things, that China would open itself to foreign capital progressively, which is a precondition for the renminbi to become an international currency. But especially after 2015, there was a kind of mini crisis in China. China clamped down with capital controls even further, and therefore, the necessary prerequisite for the Chinese currency to be an international currency, by definition, an international currency means you want foreigners using your currency, but then you should give access to foreigners of your currency, and you can't do that if you impose capital controls or are very tight on capital, on the inflow of capital especially. China under Xi has gone back on that, and so all these things that we see between the Saudis and the Chinese and the Indians and so on, I think don't fundamentally alter the fact that the renminbi cannot challenge the dollar unless China becomes more open. That's just a precondition. You can't have that. Quite apart from the fact that the Chinese financial system is less resilient than it was 10 years ago because the whole real estate thing. So the dollar renminbi thing, Chinese actions have certainly not facilitated the rise of the renminbi, but equally American actions are creating discomfort with the role of the dollar because of what's happened. So I think both parties are trying hard to not promote their currencies in any fundamental sense. So it's going to be kind of going to tread water as we go along. But the US thing is quite a seismic event. I think the world no longer sees the US as incapable of being untrustworthy when it comes to financial matters and matters related to the dollar.
Okay, well, let me open it up. Yes, sorry, in the back.
Thank you so much. I was just curious, you mentioned very briefly the sovereign debt crisis, which I think is one of the biggest global problems in the world. We have dozens of countries that are about to default on debts that they receive for development due to Ukraine, climate change, and perhaps China's role in giving out loans to countries that weren't able to actually service them. What, at this point in its history, what does India's balance in terms of being a debtor versus a creditor when it comes to development? And does it have any plans to play the role in the future that China has with its Belt and Road Initiative of being a net creditor to developing nations?
So first Firstly, the hard economics. One of the things I got right in my prediction about China's dominance was that not only would its economy grow, etc., but that it would remain a sizable net creditor to the world, right? And that's why it has whatever now $3.5–4 trillion of reserves. Now, of course, the accounting is getting murky because it's doing all this. China is doing some of this to commercial banks. The whole picture has gotten very murky. But the point is that China remains a major net creditor. It's running current account surpluses. Came down, it's come back up again, but it's been a credit. So its ability to be an international creditor is just vastly outweighs India's. India's still its current accounts are still running deficits. It lost a lot of reserves. It's come back up, but these are not its own reserves. India is not a huge net creditor in the international system. Therefore, its ability to be a creditor is going to be fundamentally determined by whether you have a lot of dollars to give or not, and it doesn't at this stage. So that's going to limit India's fundamental ability to do things on the scale of China's. By the way, let me be clear about one thing, and let me be a little bit provocative before I come to the. So a lot of my research has been on foreign aid, and when I used to go to China and talk about their dominance, they would always say, look, all you guys keep talking about threatening China. Please remember your history. The West colonized, plundered thing when they had the opportunity. When we had the opportunity, famously under Ming China and the Shanghai and the whole thing, we went, we visited, but we didn't plunder and conquer. So we are not an assertive, and that's their self-perception. So when China embarked on this Belt and Road stuff, the question going through my mind was, you guys are so smart in your reading of history. We know how this playbook ends. This movie, we've seen from the history of the West, this movie always ends badly. So why have you guys embarked on this? And I mean, it's panning out that way, whether it's Sri Lanka or whatever, if you look at the latest numbers, China is the biggest emergency creditor now to the world, partly because it had done so much lending previously. But, so the whole notion of being a creditor, a bilateral creditor, a development creditor is problematic. The history is problematic. So that's my personal view on that. But coming back to India, so I think India in the 2000s, when the boom was on, it did try and start a bit of aid, kind of a little bit of mimicry of China, to reach out. But it's very small in scale, never very big, little bit, now it started playing. So India, for the foreseeable future, is not going to be a major creditor, nowhere on the scale of any of the rich countries. So I think Sri Lanka is a bit of an exception. The region is a bit of an exception. But that's why I like the fact that it's seeing itself more as part of the multilateral process of what should rules be, good rules should be good, and I think there India is playing a constructive role, but not as a bilateral creditor.
More questions? Yeah.
I would like to hear your views a little more on the connection between the politics in India and the economic, the trade that's taking place with China. So despite the ban on TikTok and so on, and despite the skirmishes on the border, the fact seems to be that trade is increasing, at least imports from China have been going up, right? So is it the case that the government is kind of finding it difficult to follow the straightforward political line because the Indian industry really needs imports from China, and that is going to put a some restraint on what could happen politically.
I think that's partly why even after 2020 and these things, India chose its targets for sanctions very carefully. TikTok, it didn't do a Trump, for example, against China, partly for the reason that you said. We just import too many, low-cost imports. We do need from China, and it affects Indian industry's competitiveness. But as I said, with the Apple thing, it's actually going to make it even more difficult, right? So that's why it's going to be so I see this therefore as a kind of delicate balancing act where, like the US, you cannot decouple in any serious way, but you will also not consciously couple and embrace, which would be the case if it became part of RCEP and these trade agreements. So it's kind of a delicate balance between you cannot decouple, but you cannot, just as at the border, India can neither escalate nor withdraw. It's the same kind of dynamic on trade as well.
Yes.
Just follow up your thought about weaponization using dollar for geopolitical conflict, and in that sense, and the United States also become a unipolar financial power, right? And what do you think about the current cryptocurrency? Is there any role to play to counteract the dominance of US dollar?
No, I think crypto is just unambiguously bad news.
Okay.
All countries should regulate crypto as they will, and crypto will be like illicit money, and so nobody will want to embrace crypto as anything serious. And after what's happened even in the US with the Silicon Valley Bank and stuff like that, I think crypto has finally been shown to be what it really is. Something that not only must not but should not be taken seriously. Should not be taken seriously. Especially except as people wanting to dabble in kind of quirky investing. I think crypto fulfills that role. But I don't think it's a serious challenge to either the dollar or the yuan or any other currency.
Yeah. So to follow up on your comment about how India can afford to can't afford to be aggressive or to withdraw on the border and also economically, I'm curious how much of India's policy towards China, be it economic or defense policy, is passively responding to the initiatives China takes, to what extent there's some sort of strategic vision on the Indian side of what they want the relationship to be like in the long run.
That's a great question. You see, I think first of all these relationships become easier if your economy is doing well. So I think the biggest strategic decision that all countries make, including India, is that you really have to have a powerful economy growing 7-8%, and now it's a real opportunity because China is slowing down. China will slow down in the medium term. India's prospects are better in the medium term, and therefore that's going to be, as someone said, 8 to 10% growth is always the best security in strategic policy, right? So I think that's but I do think that India is being forced into thinking strategically about both the security and the economic dimension. Yes, in part because of events outside, but that's how the world happens always. But I do think that sense of a strategic thing is coming. Even as you can see from the choices that India is making on many of these things, including the Quad, the security thing with the US. I do think there is some underlying thinking going on. I think people often think that you've not thought strategically unless you've entered into an alliance or unless you've committed one way or the other, and that's just not right. I mean, a deep strategic thing could say you've got to, manage many, juggle many balls, and that's what I think India is doing, and I think it's doing it, reasonably well. But I think the best way to do it would, of course, just make sure that the economy does well and takes advantage of these new opportunities that are arising.
I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. I'm a humanist, so I'm thinking, following that question, the vision for the future. I'm wondering, because implicitly I think there is this antagonistic opposition underlying the talk, and perhaps underlying most, current conventional understanding of the relationship between China and India. I'm just wondering, what's the condition, do you think, that is necessary and needed in order for China and India to work together?
So it's a great question, and it's something that you will recall that 8 to 10 years ago, India and China and Singapore undertook this to revive this Nalanda University. And it was based on the strategic idea that what was common between India and China was the kind of Buddhist heritage. And therefore that could be, one source of this. But I think that probably a less bad answer to your terrific question would just be, I think that much more people-to-people interaction is kind of, I think, the way forward, especially encouraging, because, and that's why your question, I think, makes me go back to what I said about, when I went and met the young folks in China, they saw the potential, as it were, in a way that the strategy guys and the economists like me, all focusing on all this big power stuff, rivalry stuff. And I think, therefore, I think at the people-to-people level is where I think the future has to be much more for young students to kind of really, much more seminars, track to, but also just flows of students to universities back and forth. I think that is because I do think that this is a difficult relationship. It has a lot to overcome. The border issues are probably getting worse, if anything, because as you know, it's not just in Ladakh, but also in Arunachal Pradesh, where these things are things. So it will require a lot of hard work and openness on both sides. And that's where I think that, and that's why when I ended by saying, so military, security conflicts don't help. The kind of nationalisms on both sides that are being used for both domestic policy purposes, they also don't help. And the Indian drift away from openness and strong institutions, diversity, respect for diversity and things, and the Indian drift in the other direction is also not helping. So I think at that level of getting peoples closer to each other, and as a humanist, as you said, I think everything is going in the wrong direction, and I think one has to worry about that.
Sorry, you did mention about the Indian state becoming more like the Chinese state. Could you just elaborate more on it? Are you referring specifically to the efficiency of Indian state improving over time?
So
I didn't understand what
I was cryptic deliberately, but I meant it. I meant it three dimensions, right? One is the efficiency of building infrastructure, building roads. China has been unique in history in doing that, and in the last 20-25 years, India has capability to build infrastructure, and now on the digital, in fact, to do digital at a global, at the frontier, technological frontier, is very much state capacity in India. So that's the first similarity. The second similarity relates to that is that, the use of technology to do these things to improve state capacity is a double-edged thing. I.e., you can use the same capacity, technology for surveillance, whatever, and I think both are, on that path. At different, where exactly how much they're doing this, but you can see that both states see the potential of this for monitoring, surveillance, etc., etc. The other is I meant more the drift, political drift in India towards less openness, centralization, institutional weakening, what were traditionally India's strengths, which is what provoked that question on the part of the Chinese youngsters, 10 years ago. That is, and there it's becoming, China is becoming more aggressive, China is becoming more of a surveillance state, nationalisms are being built up to, for those, and I think there are similar things happening in India. That's the sense in which I think the drift is.
Sorry.
Thank you so much, Professor. This has been very educational. This is a very huge question. What would it take for India to become the next factory of the world? Well, I guess the positives I know are, the U.S.-China conflict, and also India surpassed China in population for sure. I think in March something, and also I guess lower average income, so maybe cheaper labor than China. But what are some negatives? What are some challenges for India to become the next China in terms of manufacturing, low-cost manufacturing, I guess?
So there, I would kind of reverse your question actually, because for the last 30-40 years, India has not been able to do manufacturing at all. So in that sense, India has been a very unique development model, which unlike all of East Asia, has not been able to use manufacturing and low-skill manufacturing to become a development powerhouse, a manufacturing powerhouse. The most likely scenario is that India will probably not be able to do that at any significant scale, because that bus has, that train has left. It left long ago, and that India will try and do more services and IT stuff as its kind of development ladder, and as it's doing very well in that. I think that was what I think we took for granted until 3 years ago, that India's model was going to be very different. I think that what is new is, given geopolitics, given all of this, can India at least reclaim some manufacturing? It's not going to be on the scale of Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Vietnam, Bangladesh, China at all, because that's gone. But can at least reclaim some manufacturing? So that's, I think, the question. It's not the question of can India become a manufacturing powerhouse. I think that question is, I think, that's kind of gone. And therefore the question is, what does India need to do to even reclaim some of this manufacturing? And I think there the answer is some of the things that India is doing. Connectivity is improving significantly. India infrastructure is being built up. I think that, but India is still not a place where investors, especially foreign investors, feel completely comfortable, because the policy environment keeps changing. For every apple that has done well in India, there have been other foreign companies that have been hurt and have left India, for example. There have been regulatory changes. And remember that India is also now pursuing a policy of favoring national champions. So what if the national champions come in conflict with your foreign investors? Is a question that foreign investors are asking themselves. So even the policy environment is not totally reassuring to foreign investors at this stage.
Go somebody else.
I've got more questions, but go ahead, unless you can start to double up here. We won't go over time, but
He mentioned about population. At the beginning of the talk, he mentioned the water as a natural resource is in great shortage. And it seems the whole country, the water will control the livelihood. And Indian population will surpass China, right? And in the very near future. And human are a major consumption of the water resources, right? And what do you think the populations and in contemporary world is it an asset or is a burden?
I think this is I don't mean to be harsh, I think it's I think this is just the wrong question in my view. Because remember, it was because people asked these kinds of questions 40, 50 years ago that led to the madness of China's one-child policy. Remember, China's fertility was coming down naturally in the 70s, but because we said population is a liability, China embarked on this an absolutely coercive, repressive, and finally unnecessary policy of the one-child policy. I mean, which in human terms has been, horrendous, right? India, because of asking this question, India did something similar in the mid-70s. Mrs. Gandhi, came and did
Sterilization.
sterilized, forced and all this. So I think, and of course, what we've learned in the last 30, 40 years is that, populations are, good or bad depending upon how they're used and opportunities they're afforded. And we discovered that, young populations were dynamic populations, and therefore population structure mattered more than the size of the population. So I think that we should not ask questions about, whether, because it just leads to, it's very dangerous thinking, and from the history we know it's led to some very bad policies. I mean, really.
I agree with you in the short term, but in the long term, in view of the climate change, so I kind of more talk about where we're at.
No, but see, the thing is that, remember, it was the same argument used 50 years ago that in the long run, the stress on resources would be too great. That's why population was bad in the long run. And we're kind of using the same argument today.
But if you look today, I thought that prophecy holds true, right? The climate change, the ravage, of the planet, the pollution.
See, but my other response to you would be that look at the way fertility has evolved in the world. Fertility reductions have been much more dramatic than anything we ever anticipated, and that's happening even in sub-Saharan Africa, where people thought, populations go down dramatically. In the latest Economist you'll read, fertility is dropping even dramatically. So these things are, self-correcting to some extent. And to the extent that they're not, I don't think we should do anything by way of what we've done in the past to rectify some of these things.
maybe I can here's the last question, which is related, because I think if I'm not mistaken, you've done some writing about climate change and the the impact of these economic trends. So, can you offer some thoughts, though, on understanding China's and India's trajectory? They are the biggest players in emissions. What is the outlook, and is it as grim as some of the other things you've discussed?
See, I think on this, I do work a little bit on this. I mean, last year, which country added the most by way of both renewable and fossil fuel is China. It's doing both, and it's a cutting edge on. And to be fair to China, I mean, the decline in the increased competitiveness of solar is a large part because China subsidized, had this industrial policy which brought down photovoltaic and solar panels. So China has provided a huge public good to the world. I think therefore on renewables, I think both countries are, and I know this is about India and the Indian Prime Minister, I think they're both very committed to the renewable agenda. Maybe for slightly different reasons. I think China sees this very much as part of those technologies of the future that it has to be on top of, and I think to some extent. And I think India has very ambitious renewable targets. I think it's very serious about, the Indian government is very serious about meeting them.
You said, I think, quite provocatively, you said that cooperation really isn't necessary in some ways.
Yeah. Because I don't think cooperation is going to happen. I think the way climate change, the only way I think climate change working is if the price of technology comes down. And that's why, I'm all in favor of the Inflation Reduction Act. Anyone and any country that's going to subsidize green technologies is doing a service to the world. So as long as we can do this without being too protectionist, industrial policy on green is, I think, unambiguous. Because this whole notion that somehow the rich countries are going to provide finance for poor countries too, it's kind of complete pie in the sky. It's complete nonsense. Not going to happen. Never happened before. Never going to happen again. So the way it happens is if technology prices come down, and it actually becomes financially viable even for the poorest countries to start adopting these technologies.
Okay, well, that's another great insight on top of a whole feast of really interesting thoughts. So thank you so much, Professor Subramanian, for joining us. And tune in on Tuesday. We will have this a webinar. We'll get a Chinese perspective on Sino-Indian relations. So anyway, please join me in thanking
Another great conference.
Yeah.
Great talk. Particularly with those slides. You summarize, the prospect well. But I agree with you. As economists, like the capitalism.
How you doing?
Good.
Yeah, good. Just got back. So,
Were you in Mainland or?
Yeah.
So, but
How was it?
we're from
Still there?
Still there, yeah. I was shocked at how.
But we're the survivors.
Just
So I'm not disagree with you.
And some things are a lot improved.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right, thank you so much. You did an amazing job. This as I predicted.
Yeah, these are all the, I know that these are all the. Oh, you're taking the Apple one? I guess I'm just in my room in case I want a snack at some point. Oh, John's a big ginger fan. He'll like this. I'll bring it for him.